Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, we return to the Pentamerone. Once again, I'd like to thank LibriVox, and I'd like to thank Joy Chan for the reading that we'll be using. Unlike in the previous weeks, I've cut out most of the scatological humour this time. Just assume it's there. It will be mentioned on a couple of occasions when it's salient to a precise plot point. And now over to Joy.
Chapter 26. The Months. It is a saying worthy to be written in letters as big as those on a monument, that silence never harmed anyone, and let it not be imagined that those slanderers who never speak well of others, but are always cutting and stinging and pinching and biting, ever gain anything by their malice. For when the bags come to be shaken out, it has always been seen, and is so still, that whilst a good word gains love and profit, slander brings enmity and ruin. And when you shall have heard how this happens, you will say, I speak with reason. Once upon a time there were two brothers, Tiane, who was as rich as a lord, and Lise, who had barely enough to live upon. But poor as one was in fortune, so pitiful was the other in mind, for he would not have given his brother a farthing were it to save his life. So that poor Lise in despair left his country, and set out to wander over the world. He wandered on and on, till one wet and cold evening he came to an inn, where he found 12 youths seated around a fire, who, when they saw poor Lise benumbed with cold, partly from the severe season, and partly from his ragged clothes, invited him to sit down by the fire. Lise accepted the invitation, for he needed it greatly, and began to warm himself. And as he was warming himself, one of the young men, whose face was such a picture of moroseness as to make you die of fright, said to him, "What think you, countryman, of this weather?"
In the Penguin edition, the young man is described in a little more detail. His body is covered in hair, and he has a frightening expression.
"What do I think of it?" replied Lise. "I think that all the months of the year perform their duty, but we, who know not what we would have, wish to give laws to heaven, and wanting to have things our own way, we do not fish deeply enough to the bottom to find out whether what comes into our fancy be good or evil, useful or hurtful. In winter, when it rains, we want the sun in Leo, and in the month of August the clouds to discharge themselves, not reflecting that were this the case, the seasons would be turned topsy-turvy, the seeds sown would be lost, the crops would be destroyed, the bodies of men would faint away, and nature would go head over heels. Therefore let us leave heaven to its own course, for it has made the tree to mitigate with its wood the severity of winter, and with its leaves the heat of summer." "You speak like Samson," replied the youth, "but you cannot deny that this month of March, in which we now are, is very impertinent to send all this frost and rain, snow and hail, wind and storm, these fogs and tempests and other troubles that make one's life a burden." "You tell only the ill of this poor month," replied Lise, "but do not speak of the benefits it yields us. For by bringing forward the spring, it commences the production of things, and is alone the cause that the sun proves the happiness of the present time, by leading him into the house of the ram." The youth was greatly pleased at what Lise said, for he was in truth no other than the month of March itself, who had arrived at that inn with his 11 brothers, and to reward Lise's goodness, who had not even found anything ill to say of a month so sad that the shepherds do not like to mention it, he gave him a beautiful little casket, saying, "Take this, and if you want anything, only ask for it, and when you open this box you will see it before you." Lise thanked the youth with many expressions of respect, and laying the little box under his head by way of a pillow, he went to sleep. As soon, however, as the sun, with the pencil of his rays, had retouched the dark shadows of night, Lise took leave of the youths and set out on his way. But he had hardly proceeded 50 steps from the inn, when opening the casket he said, "Ah, my friend, I wish I had a litter lined with cloth, and with a little fire inside, that I might travel warm and comfortable through the snow." No sooner had he uttered the words than there appeared a litter with bearers, who, lifting him up, placed him in it, whereupon he told them to carry him home. When the hour was come to set the jaws to work, Lise opened the little box and said, "I wish for something to eat." And instantly there appeared a profusion of the choicest food, and there was such a banquet that 10 crowned kings might have feasted on it. One evening, having come to a wood which did not give admittance to the sun, because he came from suspected places, Lise opened the little casket and said, "I should like to rest tonight on this beautiful spot, where the river is making harmony upon the stones as accompaniment to the song of the cool breezes."
The sun coming from suspicious places is a sort of sectarian racism, probably. The sun rises in the east, therefore it's coming from the place that's full of the people that the Italians are fighting against in the Crusades, the Muslims. There's been a change in musical styles between the two editions. The Penguin edition, which is closer to the original, has the river play counterpoint to the plain song of the breeze. Now, basically, this is because what counts as good music changes over time, and this is partially driven by technology. In How Music Works by David Byrne, for example, he mentions that our modern way of singing, which is to tremble about a note rather than hitting it exactly and holding it for as long as you can, only became popular with the invention of the vinyl record. Vibrato hides the slight imperfections in the pressing of the record that the clear note would expose. That being said, he was writing, I believe, before digital downloads became a thing and before pitch correction was widely available. This matters to magi who use performance magic, for example, because bad performances matter as much as mispronunciations of semantic components matter for other magi.
And instantly there appeared, under an oilcloth tent, a couch of fine scarlet, with down mattresses, covered with a Spanish counterpane and sheets as light as a feather.
I'm not sure why a Spanish counterpane is considered the opulent thing, but it appears in both versions. In the Penguin, it's a waxed tent, not an oilcloth, but that's still a puzzle because I didn't think waxed cotton or oilcloth went back this far historically. Oilcloth is made of cotton that's been repeatedly coated with layers of linseed oil and lead salts. Originally, both oilcloth and waxcloth, which is similar, but it's made using beeswax, were made for sails, and the offcuts were used to create waterproof clothing for sailors.
Then he asked for something to eat, and in a trice there was set out a sideboard covered with silver and gold fit for a prince. And under another tent a table was spread with viands, the savoury smell of which extended 100 miles.
In the Penguin edition, it's a cupboard or credenza. A sideboard is where English people had their servants leave dishes to the side of the actual dining table.
When he had eaten enough, he laid himself down to sleep, and as soon as the cock, who is the spy of the sun, announced to his master that the shades of night were worn and wearied, and it was now time for him, like a skilful general, to fall upon their rear and make a slaughter of them, Lise opened his little box and said, "I wish to have a handsome dress, for to-day I shall see my brother, and I should like to make his mouth water." No sooner said than done. Immediately a princely dress of the richest black velvet appeared, with edgings of red camlet, and a lining of yellow cloth embroidered all over, which looked like a field of flowers. So dressing himself, Lise got into the litter, and soon reached his brother's house.
Camlet is, in the Penguin edition, translated directly as camel hair. There was quite an industry making camlet and the less fine cameline in France during the game period. There's a pretty solid argument that the fur was actually from Angora goats. It was, as here, used in collars and cuffs. The yellow lining is felt in the Penguin edition. Felt is made by pressing fibres together rather than weaving them, so it's probably the oldest textile. In the game period, needle felting isn't practiced in Europe, so far as I'm aware, but wet felting is, and it could be used to make cloth out of all sorts of odd fibres. This would in turn grant strange material bonuses.
When Ciane saw his brother arrive with all this splendour and luxury, he wished to know what good fortune had befallen him. Then Lise told him of the youths whom he had met in the inn, and of the present they had made him, but he kept to himself his conversation with the youths. Ciane now was all impatience to get away from his brother, and told him to go and rest himself, as he was no doubt tired. Then he started post-haste, and soon arrived at the inn, where, finding the same youths, he fell into chat with them. And when the youth asked him the same question, what he thought of that month of March, Cianne, making a big mouth, said, "Confound the miserable month, the enemy of shepherds, which stirs up all the ill humours and brings sickness to our bodies. A month of which, whenever we would announce ruin to a man, we say, 'Go, March has shaved you.' A month of which, when you want to call a man presumptuous, you say, 'What cares March?' A month, in short, so hateful that it would be the best fortune for the world, the greatest blessing to the earth, the greatest gain to man, were it excluded from the band of brothers."
In the Penguin edition, the first curse he gives to March is enemy of those with the French disease. The French disease in this case is syphilis. It first appears in the written record with French troops besieging Naples in the 15th century. So it occurs outside of the Ars Magica period, but is something novel and unpleasant during the Magonomia period.
March, who heard himself thus slandered, suppressed his anger till the morning, intending then to reward Cianne for his calumny. And when Cianne wished to depart, he gave him a fine whip, saying to him, "Whenever you wish for anything, only say, 'Whip, give me 100,' and you shall see pearls strung upon a rush."
In the Penguin edition, it's a flail rather than a whip. Flails are agricultural tools used for separating wheat from chaff if you don't have a millstone or a watermill or a quern. They've gone out of use by the Victorian era, so maybe that's why they were removed from the version Joy Chan's reading. The type of flail described, the scoratio, is made of 2 rods of wood tied together with a leather belt between them. So it's similar in function to the nunchaku.
Cianne, thanking the youth, went his way in great haste, not wishing to make trial of the whip until he reached home. But hardly had he set foot in the house when he went into a secret chamber, intending to hide the money which he expected to receive from the whip. Then he said, "Whip, give me 100," and thereupon the whip gave him more than he looked for, making a score on his legs and face like a musical composer, so that Lise, hearing his cries, came running to the spot, and when he saw that the whip, like a runaway horse, could not stop itself, he opened the little box and brought it to a standstill. Then he asked Cianne what had happened to him, and upon hearing his story, he told him he had no one to blame but himself, for like a blockhead he alone had caused his own misfortune, acting like the camel that wanted to have horns and lost its ears.
That's a reference to one of Aesop's fables. In the fable, the camel prays to Zeus and says, "I want to have horns like the bull," and Zeus punishes its pride by cutting the tips off of its ears.
But he bade him mind another time and keep a bridle on his tongue, which was the key that had opened to him the storehouse of misfortune. For if he had spoken well of the youths, he would perhaps have had the same good fortune, especially as to speak well of any one is a merchandise that costs nothing, and usually brings profit that is not expected. In conclusion, Lise comforted him, bidding him not seek more wealth than heaven had give him, for his little casket would suffice to fill the houses of 30 misers, and Cianne should be master of all he possessed, since to the generous man heaven is treasurer. And he added that, although another brother might have borne Cianne ill will for the cruelty with which he had treated him in his poverty, yet he reflected that his avarice had been a favourable wind which had brought him to this port, and therefore wished to show himself grateful for the benefit. When Cianne heard these things, he begged his brother's pardon for his past unkindness, and entering into partnership, they enjoyed together their good fortune, and from that time forward Cianne spoke well of everything, however bad it might be, for the dog that was scaled with hot water for ever dreads that which is cold. Chapter 27. Pinto Smolto. It has always been more difficult for a man to keep than to get, for in the one case fortune aids, which often assists in justice, but in the other case sense is required. Therefore we frequently find a person deficient in cleverness rise to wealth, and then, from want of sense, roll over heels to the bottom, as you will see clearly from the story I am going to tell you, if you are quick of understanding. A merchant once had an only daughter whom he wished greatly to see married, but as often as he struck this note, he found her 100 miles off from the desired pitch, for the foolish girl would never consent to marry, and the father was in consequence the most unhappy and miserable man in the world.
She doesn't just refuse to marry, she refuses to date. Or, as the Penguin edition puts it, quote, "She banned the passage of any man through her territory as if it was no trespass zone or a private hunting ground. Her tribunal was always closed for holidays, her school on vacation, her bank always closed for court festivities."
Now it happened one day that he was going to a fair. So he asked his daughter, who was named Betta, what she would like him to bring her on his return. And she said, "Papa, if you love me, bring me 1/2 weight of Palermo sugar, and as much again of sweet almonds, with 4 to 6 bottles of scented water, and a little musk and amber. Also 40 pearls, 2 sapphires, a few garnets and rubies, with some gold thread, and above all a trough and a little silver trowel." Her father wondered at this extravagant demand. Nevertheless, he would not refuse his daughter. So he went to the fair, and on his return brought her all that she had requested.
In the Penguin edition, it's 1/2 quintal of sugar and the same amount of ambrosial almonds. The trowel is a scalpel, and the trough is a bowl.
As soon as Betta received these things, she shut herself up in a chamber, and began to make a great quantity of paste of almonds and sugar, mixed with rosewater and perfumes, and set to work to form a most beautiful youth, making his hair of gold thread, his eyes of sapphires, his teeth of pearls, his lips of rubies, and she gave him such grace that speech alone was wanting to him. When she had done all this, having heard say that at the prayers of a certain king of Cyprus a statue had once come to life, she prayed to the goddess of love so long that at last the statue began to open its eyes. And increasing her prayers, it began to breathe. And after breathing, words came out. And at last, disengaging all its limbs, it began to walk.
The king of Cyprus is Pygmalion, and the statue Galatea. We have not really worked that story very hard in Ars Magica. I presume the statue is possessed by a fairy, and people who are descended from it have strong fairy blood. But you could argue instead that it is an aspect of Venus, and she's a Titan rather than an Olympian, so the children would have strong magical blood. Either way, their descendants founded the city of Paphos on Cyprus, so they'd probably be found there still, were Magi to look. That being said, descendants of the emperors of Constantinople turn up in Cornwall in slightly after the game period, so put them wherever you need to in mythic Europe.
With a joy far greater than if she had gained a kingdom, Betta embraced and kissed the youth, and taking him by the hand, she led him before her father and said, "My lord and father, you have always told me that you wished to see me married, and in order to please you I have now chosen a husband after my own heart." When her father saw the handsome youth come out of his daughter's womb, whom he had not seen enter it, he stood amazed, and at the sight of such beauty, which folks would have paid a halfpenny a head to gaze at, he consented that the marriage should take place. So a great feast was made, at which, among the other ladies present, there appeared a great unknown queen, who, seeing the beauty of Pintosmalto, for that was the name Betta gave him, fell desperately in love with him. Now Pintosmalto, who had only opened his eyes on the wickedness of the world 3 hours before, and was as innocent as a babe, accompanied the strangers who had come to celebrate his nuptials to the stairs, as his bride had told him, and when he did the same with this queen, she took him by the hand and led him quietly to her coach, drawn by 6 horses, which stood in the courtyard. Then taking him into it, she ordered the coachman to drive off and away to her country.
The Penguin edition notes that he's a simpleton, which has theological consequences. For example, I'm not sure how he can possibly be married, given that he's basically made of marzipan and sacraments are for humans. That aside, if he lacks the knowledge of the nature of the contract, he can't consent to marriage.
After Betta had waited a while in vain, expecting Pintosmalto to return, she sent down into the courtyard to see whether he was speaking with anyone there. Then she sent up to the roof to see if he had gone to take fresh air.
She also checks to see if he's gone to serve his vital needs. I wasn't going to mention toilet humour this time, but I wanted to mark that she believes he eats and excretes.
But finding him nowhere, she directly imagined that, on account of his great beauty, he had been stolen from her. So she ordered the usual proclamations to be made. But at last, as no tidings of him were brought, she formed the resolution to go all the world over in search of him, and dressing herself as a poor girl, she set out on her way. After some months she came to the house of a good old woman, who received her with great kindness.
In the Penguin edition, Beta is also pregnant.
And when she had heard Betta's misfortune, she took compassion on her, and taught her 3 sayings. The first was, Trique Velaque, the house reigns. The second, Anola Tranola, the fountain plays. The third, Scatola Matola, the sun shines. Telling her to repeat these words whenever she was in trouble, and they would be of good service to her.
2 of these are phrases from Italian children's games.
Betta wondered greatly at this present of chaff. Nevertheless, she said to herself, he who blows into your mouth does not wish to see you dead, and the plant that strikes root does not wither.
Blowing in, or as the Penguin edition notes, spitting in, someone's mouth is, in period, considered the correct way to revive them. It was believed to prevent the spirit from leaving the body. This is a primitive form of resuscitation.
Everything has its use. Who knows what good fortune may be contained in these words? So saying, she thanked the old woman, and set out upon her way. And after a long journey she came to a beautiful city called Round Mount, where she went straight to the royal palace, and begged for the love of heaven a little shelter in the stable.
For she was about to give birth.
So the ladies of the court ordered a small room to be given her on the stairs, and while poor Betta was sitting there, she saw Pintosmalto pass by, whereat her joy was so great that she was on the point of slipping down from the tree of life. But seeing the trouble she was in, Betta wished to make proof of the first saying which the old woman had told her, and no sooner had she repeated the words, Trique Velaque, the house reigns, than instantly there appeared before her a beautiful little coach of gold, set all over with jewels, which ran about the chamber of itself, and was a wonder to behold. When the ladies of the court saw this sight, they went and told the Queen, who without loss of time ran to Betta's chamber, and when she saw the beautiful little coach, she asked whether she would sell it, and offered to give whatever she might demand. But Betta replied that, although she was poor, she would not sell it for all the gold in the world, but if the Queen wished for the little coach, she must allow her to pass one night at the door of Pintosmalto's chamber.
In the Penguin edition, it's far more direct. The heroine says her own pleasure is more important to her than wealth, and so the Queen must allow her to sleep with her husband for a night.
The Queen was amazed at the folly of the poor girl, who, although she was all in rags, would nevertheless give up such riches for a mere whim. However, she resolved to take the good mouthful offered her, and, by giving Pintosmalto a sleeping draught, to satisfy the poor girl, but pay her in bad coin.
The sleeping draught is literally opium in the Penguin edition, which means that it's available for Ars Magica characters and for our Venetian alchemist witches.
As soon as the night was come, when the stars in the sky and the glowworms on the earth were to pass in review.
Fireflies in the original? In the UK they have a beetle they call both the glowworm and the firefly. Their light is green, which as an Australian is about as odd as learning that your swans are white. Here, glowworm caves are filled with tiny blue lights, which mimic stars as a hunting strategy.
The Queen gave a sleeping draught to Pintosmalto, who did everything he was told, and sent him to bed. And no sooner had he thrown himself on the mattress than he fell as sound asleep as a dormouse.
Dormice hibernate. They aren't a true mouse, and the Romans used to eat them. I think they put a recipe for them in Sanctuary of Ice, because House Yarburton likes its little luxuries.
Poor Betta, who thought that night to relate all her past troubles, seeing now that she had no audience, fell to lamenting beyond measure, blaming herself for all that she had done for his sake. And the unhappy girl never closed her mouth, nor did the sleeping Pintosmalto ever open his eyes until the sun appeared with the aqua regia of his rays to separate the shades from the light.
Aqua regia is etching acid. It was of interest to alchemists because it can dissolve gold. It's a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids in the modern day, but in the game period it's made directly by mixing nitric acid with sal ammoniac. It's only attested in writing at about 1300, so it might be a discovery made by the player characters through original research. By the Maginoma period, it's widely enough known that coded representations of it appear in alchemical treatises. There's an image on the blog that accompanies the podcast from a German treatise published in 1600. In it, a fox is shown eating a rooster, and this is Aqua regia eating gold, and a dragon at the forefront of the picture represents the red crystal that precipitates from this reaction.
When the queen came down, and taking Pintosmalto by the hand, said to Betta, "Now be content." "May you have such content all the days of your life," replied Betta in an undertone, "for I have passed so bad a night that I shall not soon forget it." The poor girl, however, could not resist her longing, and resolved to make trial of the second saying. So she repeated the words, "Anola tranola, the fountain plays," and instantly there appeared a golden cage with a beautiful bird made of precious stones and gold, which sang like a nightingale. When the ladies saw this, they went and told it to the queen, who wished to see the bird. Then she asked the same question as about the little coach, and Betta made the same reply as before. Whereupon the queen, who perceived, as she thought, what a silly creature Betta was, promised to grant her request, and took the cage with the bird. And as soon as night came, she gave Pintosmalto a sleeping draught as before, and sent him to bed. When Betta saw that he slept like a dead person, she began again to wail and lament, saying things that would have moved a flintstone to compassion.
It's a person whose throat has been cut and a flagstone in the Penguin edition. Flint is particularly hard, hence hard-hearted, but I'm not able to find a first attestation. Biblically, there are references to people with faces like Flint.
And thus she passed another night, full of trouble, weeping and wailing and tearing her hair. But as soon as it was day, the queen came to fetch her captive, and left poor Betta in grief and sorrow, and biting her hands with vexation at the trick that had been played her. In the morning, when Pintosmalto went to a garden outside the city gate to pluck some figs, he met a cobbler, who lived in a room close to where Betta lay, and had not lost a word of all she had said.
In the Penguin edition, it's a junk seller, by which I presume it means something like a tinker or a rag and bone man.
Then he told Pintosmalto of the weeping, lamentation, and crying of the unhappy beggar girl. And when Pintosmalto, who already began to get a little more sense, heard this, he guessed how matters stood, and resolved that, if the same thing happened again, he would not drink what the queen gave him. Betta now wished to make the third trial, so she said the words, "Scatola matola, the sun shines," and instantly there appeared a quantity of stuffs of silk and gold and embroidered scarfs, with a golden cup. In short, the queen herself could not have brought together so many beautiful ornaments.
In the Penguin edition, they're lined with seashells, which I would keep so that we could maintain the connection between Galatea and Venus rising in the shell from the foam of the destruction of Zeus's father.
When the ladies saw these things, they told their mistress, who endeavoured to obtain them as she had done the others. But Betta replied as before, that if the queen wished to have them, she must let her spend the night at the door of the chamber. Then the queen said to herself, "What can I lose by satisfying this silly girl, in order to get from her these beautiful things?" So taking all the treasures which Betta offered her, as soon as night appeared, the instrument for the debt contracted with sleep and repose being liquidated, she gave the sleeping draught to Pintosmalto. But this time he did not swallow it, and making an excuse to leave the room, he spat it out again, and then went to bed.
In the Penguin edition, he leaves the room for a call of nature, so he eats and excretes. Then again, we know he must be organic in some sense, because he's drinking sleeping draughts. If you pour opium into a cake, you don't make a sleepy cake.
Betta now began the same tune again, saying how she had kneaded him with her own hands of sugar and almonds, how she had made his hair of gold and his eyes and mouth of pearls and precious stones, and how he was indebted to her for his life, which the gods had granted to her prayers, and lastly how he had been stolen from her, and she had gone seeking him with such toil and trouble. Then she went on to tell him how she had watched 2 nights at the door of his room, and for leave to do so had given up 2 treasures, and yet had not been able to hear a single word from him, so that this was the last night of her hopes and the conclusion of her life. When Pintosmalto, who had remained awake, heard these words, and called to mind as a dream all that had passed, he rose and embraced her. And as Night had just come forth with her black mask to direct the dance of the stars, he went very quietly into the chamber of the Queen, who was in a deep sleep, and took from her all the things that she had taken from Betta, and all the jewels and money which were in a desk, to repay himself for his past troubles. Then returning to his wife, they set off that very hour, and travelled on until they arrived
at a comfortable inn where she gave birth. Or, in the English edition,
her father's house, where they found him alive and well. And from the joy of seeing his daughter again, he became like a boy of 15 years. But when the Queen found neither Pintosmalto nor beggar girl nor jewels, she tore her hair and rent her clothes, and called to mind the saying, "He who cheats must not complain if he be cheated." Chapter 28. The Golden Root. A person who is over-curious and wants to know more than he ought, always carries the match in his hand to set fire to the powder-room of his own fortunes. And he who pries into others' affairs is frequently a loser in his own. For generally he who digs holes to search for treasures comes to a ditch into which he himself falls, as happened to the daughter of a gardener in the following manner. There was once a gardener who was so very, very poor that, however hard he worked, he could not manage to get bread for his family. So he gave 3 little pigs to his 3 daughters, that they might rear them, and thus get something for a little dowry. Then Pascuzza and Cice, who were the eldest, drove their little pigs to feed in a beautiful meadow. But they would not let Parmetella, who was the youngest daughter, go with them, and sent her away, telling her to go and feed her pigs somewhere else. So Parmetella drove her little animal into a wood, where the shades were holding out against the assaults of the sun, and coming to a pasture, in the middle of which flowed a fountain that, like the hostess of an inn where cold water is sold, was inviting the passers-by with its silver tongue, she found a certain tree with golden leaves. Then plucking one of them, she took it to her father, who with great joy sold it for more than 20 ducats, which served to stop up a hole in his affairs. And when he asked Parmetella where she had found it, she said, "Take it, sir, and ask no questions, unless you would spoil your good fortune." The next day she returned and did the same, and she went on plucking the leaves from the tree until it was entirely stripped, as if it had been plundered by the winds of autumn. Then she perceived that the tree had a large golden root, which she could not pull up with her hands. So she went home, and fetching an axe, set to work to lay bare the root around the foot of the tree. And raising the trunk as well as she could, she found under it a beautiful porphyry staircase.
So in the Penguin edition, the trunk is gold. She cuts off the roots to allow her to take the trunk home. Porphyry is a purple gemstone of particular interest to the emperors of Constantinople. There was a room used for royal births in the palace, veneered with it, so those born after their father had taken power were called porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. Purple-born brides turn up twice in our look at Venetian magic, once to start things off with Teodora Selvo, and once for the Dogaressa in 1220. No, I'm wrong. She's a Norman. I'm going to have to check that.
Parmetella, who was curious beyond measure, went down the stairs, and walking through a large and deep cavern, she came to a beautiful plain, on which was a splendid palace, where only gold and silver were trodden underfoot, and pearls and precious stones everywhere met the eye. And as Parmetella stood wondering at all these splendid things, not seeing any person moving among so many beautiful fixtures, she went into a chamber, in which were a number of pictures. and on them were seen painted various beautiful things, especially the ignorance of man esteemed wise, the injustice of him who held the scales, the injuries avenged by heaven, things truly to amaze one. And in the same chamber also was a splendid table, set out with things to eat and to drink. Seeing no one, Parmetella, who was very hungry, sat down at a table to eat like a fine count. But whilst she was in the midst of the feast, behold, a handsome slave entered, who said, "Stay! Do not go away, for I will have you for my wife, and will make you the happiest woman in the world." In spite of her fear, Parmetella took heart at this good offer, and consenting to what the slave proposed, a coach of diamonds was instantly given her, drawn by 4 golden steeds, with wings of emeralds and rubies, who carried her flying through the air to take an airing, and a number of apes, clad in cloth of gold, were given to attend on her person, who forthwith arrayed her from head to foot, and adorned her so that she looked just like a queen. When night was come, and the sun, desiring to sleep on the banks of the river of India, untroubled by gnats, had put out the light, the slave said to Parmetella, "My dear, now go to rest in this bed, but remember first to put out the candle, and mind what I say, or ill will betide you." Then Parmetella did as he told her, but no sooner had she closed her eyes than the blackamoor, changing to a handsome youth, lay down to sleep. But the next morning, ere the dawn went forth to seek fresh eggs in the fields of the sky.
In the Penguin edition, it says that her eyes were sprinkled with poppy dust, as a way of saying she fell asleep. This is another reference to opium.
The youth arose and took his other form again, leaving Parmetella full of wonder and curiosity. And again the following night, when Parmetella went to rest, she put out the candle as she had done the night before, and the youth came as usual and lay down to sleep. But no sooner had he shut his eyes than Parmetella arose, took a steel which she had provided, and lighting the tinder applied a match. Then taking the candle she raised the coverlet, and beheld the ebony turned to ivory, and the coal to chalk.
Coal and chalk are English editions. The Penguin edition gives the caviar had turned to milk, which indicates caviar is known in medieval Italy. I'd make the point that caviar wasn't necessarily a luxury good at the time. I'll need to check. In the United States, for example, they used to serve it for free on saloon bars, much as they serve salty peanuts today, to encourage drinkers to consume more.
And whilst she stood gazing with open mouth and contemplating the most beautiful pencilling that nature had ever given upon the canvas of wonder, the youth awoke and began to reproach Parmetella, saying, "Ah, woe is me! For your prying curiosity I have to suffer another 7 years this accursed punishment. But begone, run, scamper off, take yourself out of my sight. You know not what good fortune you lose." So saying, he vanished like quicksilver.
In the Penguin edition, he flies away. This is obviously Cupid and Psyche. At least she didn't burn him with the candle.
The poor girl left the palace, cold and stiff with affright, and with her head bowed to the ground. And when she had come out of the cavern, she met a fairy, who said to her, "My child, how my heart grieves at your misfortune. Unhappy girl, you are going to the slaughter-house, where you will pass over the bridge no wider than a hair."
The bridge no wider than a hair is found in Islamic folklore, in hell. So I'm surprised to find it in this collection.
Therefore, to provide against your peril, take these 7 spindles with these 7 figs, and a little jar of honey, and these 7 pairs of iron shoes, and walk on and on without stopping, until they are worn out. Then you will see 7 women standing upon a balcony of a house, and spinning from above down to the ground, with the thread wound upon the bone of a dead person. Remain quite still and hidden, and when the thread comes down, take out the bone and put in its place a spindle besmeared with honey, with a fig in the place of the little button. Then, as soon as the women draw up the spindles and taste the honey, they will say, "He who has made my spindle sweet shall in return with good fortune meet." And after repeating these words, they will say, one after another, "O you who brought us these sweet things, appear." Then you must answer, "Nay, for you will eat me." And they will say, "We swear by our spoon that we will not eat you." But do not stir, and they will continue, "We swear by our spit that we will not eat you." But stand firm as if rooted to the spot, and they will say, "We swear by our broom that we will not eat you." Still do not believe them, and when they say, "We swear by our pail that we will not eat you," shut your mouth and say not a word, or it will cost you your life.
Just to remind you, this is the Pentamerone. In the Penguin edition, this is a chamber pot, not a pail. The cost of answering at too early a point is fatal diarrhea.
At last they will say, "We swear by thunder and lightning that we will not eat you." Then take courage and mount up, for they will do you no harm. When Parmetella heard this, she set off and walked over hill and dale, until at the end of 7 years the iron shoes were worn out. And coming to a large house with a projecting balcony, she saw the 7 women spinning. So she did as the fairy had advised her, and after 1,000 wiles and allurements, they swore by thunder and lightning, whereupon she showed herself and mounted up. Then they all 7 said to her, "Traitress, you are the cause that our brother has lived twice 7 long years in the cavern, far away from us, in the form of a blackamoor. But never mind, although you have been clever enough to stop our throat with the oath, you shall on the first opportunity pay off both the old and the new reckoning. But now hear what you must do. Hide yourself behind this trough, and when our mother comes, who would swallow you down at once, rise up and seize her behind her back. Hold her fast, and do not let her go until she swears by thunder and lightning not to harm you."
The instruction is literally, seize her tits which she carries on her shoulders. This is oddly similar to the Irish method of avoiding doom at the hands of the washerwoman at the ford, who will give predictions to the person who seizes her on the folkloristic assumption that that person is her son or daughter.
Parmetella did as she was bid, and after the ogress had sworn by the fire shovel, by the spinning wheel, by the reel, by the sideboard, and by the peg, at last she swore by thunder and lightning, whereupon Parmetella let go her hold, and showed herself to the ogress, who said, "You have caught me this time, but take care, traitress, for at the first shower I'll send you to the lava." One day the ogress, who was on the lookout for an opportunity to devour Parmetella, took 12 sacks of various seeds, peas, chickpeas, lentils, vetches, kidney beans, beans, and lupins, and mixed them all together. Then she said to her, "Traitress, take these seeds and sort them all, so that each kind may be separated from the rest, and if they are not all sorted by this evening, I'll swallow you like a penny tart."
In the Penguin edition, it's a threepenny fritter. This early, the ability to make tart crust is not well developed in Europe.
Poor Parmetella sat down beside the sacks weeping, and said, "Oh, mother, mother, how will this golden root prove a root of woes to me? Now is my misery completed. By seeing a black face turned white, all has become black before my eyes. Alas, I am ruined and undone. There is no help for it. I already seem as if I were in the throat of that horrid ogress. There is no one to help me. There is no one to advise me. There is no one to comfort me." As she was lamenting thus, lo, thunder and lightning appeared like a flash, for the banishment laid upon him by the spell had just ended. Although he was angry with Parmetella, yet his blood could not turn to water, and seeing her grieving thus, he said to her, "Traitress, what makes you weep so?" Then she told him of his mother's ill treatment of her, and her wish to make an end of her and eat her up. But Thunder and Lightning replied, "Calm yourself and take heart, for it shall not be as she said." And instantly scattering all the seeds on the ground, he made a deluge of ants spring up, who forthwith set to work to heap up all the seeds separately, each kind by itself, and Parmetella filled the sacks with them. When the ogress came home and found the task done, she was almost in despair, and cried, "That dog Thunder and Lightning has played me this trick, but you shall not escape thus. So take these pieces of bed-tick, which are enough for 12 mattresses, and mind that by this evening they are filled with feathers, or else I will make mincemeat of you." The poor girl took the bed-ticks, and sitting down upon the ground began to weep and lament bitterly, making 2 fountains of her eyes. But presently Thunder and Lightning appeared, and said to her, "Do not weep, traitress, leave it to me, and I will bring you to port. So let down your hair, spread the bed-ticks upon the ground, and fall to weeping and wailing, and crying out that the King of the Birds is dead. Then you'll see what will happen." Parmetella did as she was told, and behold a cloud of birds suddenly appeared that darkened the air. And flapping their wings they let fall their feathers by basketfuls, so that in less than an hour the mattresses were all filled. When the ogress came home and saw the task done, she swelled up with rage till she almost burst, saying, "Thunder and Lightning is determined to plague me, but may I be dragged at an ape's tail if I let her escape." Then she said to Parmetella, "Run quickly to my sister's house, and tell her to send me the musical instruments, for I have resolved that Thunder and Lightning shall marry, and we will make a feast fit for a king." At the same time she sent to bid her sister, when the poor girl came to ask for the instruments, instantly to kill and cook her, and she would come and partake of the feast. Parmetella, hearing herself ordered to perform an easier task, was in great joy, thinking that the weather had begun to grow milder. Alas, how crooked is human judgment! On the way she met Thunder and Lightning, who, seeing her walking at a quick pace, said to her, "Whither are you going, wretched girl? See you not that you are on the way to the slaughter, that you are forging your own fetters, and sharpening the knife, and mixing the poison for yourself, that you are sent to the ogress for her to swallow you? But listen to me, and fear not. Take this little loaf, this bundle of hay, and this stone, and when you come to the house of my aunt you will find a bulldog, which will fly barking at you to bite you. But give him this little loaf, and it will stop his throat. And when you have passed the dog, you will meet a horse running loose, which will run up to kick and trample on you. But give him the hay, and you will clog his feet. At last you will come to a door, hanging to and fro continually. Put this stone before it, and you will stop its fury. Then mount upstairs, and you find the ogress, with a little child in her arms, and the oven ready to bake you. Whereupon she will say to you, 'Hold this little creature, and wait here till I go and fetch the instruments.' But mind, she will only go to whet her tusks, in order to tear you in pieces."
So that's his cousin. In the Penguin edition, he says not to worry because she is of ogre meat. Originally, I read this as being an instruction meaning that the girl was of no moral account as a non-human, but that doesn't make sense because they're members of the same family. Perhaps he means she's not harmed by the process due to her magical nature. No, having checked the rest of the story, he does not. This is just a plot hole.
Then throw the little child into the oven without pity. Take the instruments which stand behind the door, and hie off before the ogress returns, or else you are lost. The instruments are in a box, but beware of opening it, or you will repent." Parmetella did all that Thunder and Lightning told her, but on her way back with the instruments she opened the box, and lo and behold, they all flew out and about, here a flute, there a flageolet, here a pipe, there a bagpipe, making 1,000 different sounds in the air, whilst Parmetella stood looking on and tearing her hair in despair.
The instruments are the same in the Penguin edition, even the bagpipe. Well, it's a cheerio, but that's close enough. There is one difference. The flageolet is a schwarm. A flageolet is a sort of flute. It's related to the tin whistle or the recorder. Why it's named after a particularly delicious type of bean is unclear to me. A schwarm is a double reed instrument that looks like a wooden medieval trumpet. It was popular in the Ars Magica period, but it was the ancestor of the oboe, which has basically driven it to extinction.
Meanwhile the ogress came downstairs, and not finding Parmetella she went to the window and called out to the door, "Crush that traitress!" But the door answered, "I will not use the poor girl ill, for she has made me at last stand still." Then the ogress cried out to the horse, "Trample on the thief!" But the horse replied, "Let the poor girl go her way, for she has given me the hay." And lastly the ogress called to the dog, saying, "Bite the rogue!" But the dog answered, "I'll not hurt a hair of her head, for she it was who gave me the bread." Now as Parmetella ran crying after the instruments, she met Thunder and Lightning, who scolded her well, saying, Traitress, will you not learn at your cost that by your fatal curiosity you are brought to this plight?" Then he called back the instruments with a whistle, and shut them up again in the box, telling Parmetella to take them to his mother. But when the ogress saw her, she cried aloud, "O cruel fate! Even my sister is against me, and refuses to give me this pleasure." Meanwhile the new bride arrived, a hideous pest, a compound of ugliness, a harpy, an evil shade, a horror, a monster, a large tub, who with 100 flowers and bows about her looked like a newly opened inn. Then the ogress made a great banquet for her, and being full of gall and malice, she had the table placed close to a well, where she seated her 7 daughters, each with a torch in one hand. But she gave 2 torches to Parmetella, and made her sit at the edge of the well, on purpose that, when she fell asleep, she might tumble to the bottom. Now whilst the dishes were passing to and fro, and their blood began to get warm, Thunder and Lightning, who turned quite sick at the sight of the new bride, said to Parmetella, "Traitress, do you love me?" "Ay, to the top of the roof," she replied. And he answered, "If you love me, give me a kiss." "Nay," said Parmetella, "you indeed who have such a pretty creature at your side. Heaven preserve her to you 100 years in health and with plenty of sons." Then the new bride answered, "It is very clear that you are a simpleton, and would remain so were you to live 100 years, acting the prude as you do, and refusing to kiss so handsome a youth, whilst I let a herdsman kiss me for a couple of chestnuts." At these words the bridegroom swelled with rage like a toad, so that his food remained sticking in his throat. However, he put a good face on the matter and swallowed the pill, intending to make the reckoning and settle the balance afterwards. But when the tables were removed and the ogress and his sisters had gone away, Thunder and Lightning said to the new bride, "Wife, did you see this proud creature refuse me a kiss?" "She was a simpleton," replied the bride, "to refuse a kiss to such a handsome young man, whilst I let a herdsman kiss me for a couple of chestnuts." Thunder and Lightning could contain himself no longer. The mustard got up into his nose, and with the flash of scorn and the thunder of action, he seized a knife and stabbed the bride, and digging a hole in the cellar, he buried her. Then embracing Parmetella, he said to her, "You are my jewel, the flower of women, the mirror of honour. Then turn those eyes upon me, give me that hand, put out those lips, draw near to me, my heart, for I will be yours as long as the world lasts."
In the Penguin edition, they then go to bed and have intercourse, so they've had a very full day.
The next morning, when the sun aroused his fiery steeds from their watery stable, and drove them to pasture on the fields sown by the dawn, the ogress came with fresh eggs for the newly married couple, that the young wife might be able to say, "Happy is she who marries and gets a mother-in-law."
Giving eggs to a newly married couple is a ritual also found in Venice, in the period we're interested in for the other series of episodes. It's a fertility ritual. Usually it's done by the bridal party rather than the mother-in-law.
But finding Parmetella in the arms of her son, and hearing what had passed, she ran to her sister to concert some means of removing this thorn from her eyes without her son's being able to prevent it. But when she found that her sister, out of grief at the loss of her daughter, had crept into the oven herself and was burnt, her despair was so great that from an ogress she became a ram, and butted her head against the wall until she broke her pate.
In the Penguin edition, she splatters her brains about, and also the smell of the 2 cooked ogres is so disgusting it fills the whole neighbourhood, perhaps attracting magi.
Then Thunder and Lightning made peace between Parmetella and her sisters-in-law, and they all lived happy and content, finding the saying come true, that patience conquers all.
Translated slightly differently in the Penguin edition as "those who resist win." But your saga may vary.